Hello and welcome to today's edition of Liberty Action Network TV. I'm your host, Doreen Finkel, and today we are going to be talking about the Second Amendment. And joining me here today is Commissioner of Carroll County, Maryland, Richard Rothschild. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Doreen. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I want to first start off by saying this. Many believe that the Second Amendment is under attack. Can you tell us why our founding fathers put it in place?
Well, yes, the Second Amendment is under attack in America today. And there's a lot of data out there or misstatements being made with respect to why we have a Second Amendment. It is not there so that we can go deer hunting. The Second Amendment is there because our forefathers understood that one of the greatest threats to their life, liberty, and property was government potentially running amok. And our forefathers understood that by granting our citizens the right to keep and bear arms, a right that shall not be infringed, that created a balance of power between citizens and their government to ensure that government was serving the people and not the other way around. You know, Patrick Henry had an interesting comment about the Constitution. I'll read it. He said, "The Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. It is an instrument for the people to restrain the government." And what that means, and what the implications of that are this. Citizens cannot restrain their government if their government is armed, and they are not. And our founding fathers understood that.
And I also want to point out that it's part of the Bill of Rights and focuses on the Constitution, the first
Right.
10 amendments.
Yes.
And I often say this, that the schools don't teach the Constitution like they should, but that's a topic for another day. I also want to get to the fact that Carroll County is the third county in Maryland, the other two being Hartford and Cecil, to pass a resolution in support of the right to bear arms. It is in response to the Maryland State Firearms Act of 2013 by the legislators and Governor O'Malley. What are some of the provisions in this act, and when does it take effect?
Well, first of all, let me say this. This brings a very important question up for all elected officials. Are we simply agents of the state? Is our job to simply blindly enforce state policies, regardless of whether or not we believe they're constitutional or not? See, I would say no. When we are elected into office, every elected official takes an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And I believe it is incumbent on every local official across the U.S. to recognize that if we are asked to do something that we reasonably deem to be unconstitutional, then we have an affirmative duty to resist. And we do believe that the Maryland Firearms Safety Act of 2013 infringes on the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And not only does the legislative branch of government believe that, but our state's attorney has expressed grave concerns, and our executive leader, our sheriff, believes the same thing, that it infringes on the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and therefore we believe we had an affirmative duty to resist. So what this thing does, in very simple terms, is it states that since we don't have the power to undo state legislation, what it says is, you know what, you can pass your state legislation, but we're not going to authorize the use of our resources or funds or agencies or buildings or detention centers for purposes of enforcing any element of this bill that we deem reasonably unconstitutional. And some of those things include requirements to register existing lawfully owned firearms, prohibitions on or restrictions related to ownership of non-fully automatic firearms, prohibitions limiting accessories such as hand grips or flash suppressors or bayonet mounts or magazine capacities, or requirements to do background checks beyond those customarily required at time of purchase prior to the passage of the Maryland Firearms Act.
So the Second Amendment Preservation Resolution, which is a resolution that you guys passed, is generally or largely symbolic. And then what does it say to you, to your legislators and your people that you serve?
Well, a lot of people say it's largely symbolic. I really do not agree that that's an accurate characterization. I believe it does have substantive impact. If a sheriff won't arrest and a state's attorney won't prosecute because they believe something is unconstitutional, that's powerful. Oh. Second thing, this will likely determine who becomes our next sheriff and who becomes our next state's attorney during the next election, because I don't believe anyone has a chance of getting elected in this county unless they support this resolution in support of the Second Amendment. And third, it sends a very strong message to Annapolis. We're not going to consider to sit back and do nothing. We are going to fight back. And I've told people this is equivalent to the Jimmy Doolittle raid on Japan after they bombed Pearl Harbor. We knew we weren't going to win the war, but we showed our enemy that we could hit them, and we showed our supporters that we were capable of striking back. And it's time for local officials to stand up and do something. And we did something very interesting with this. You know, across the people said to me, well, you can't do this. You're nullifying a state law. You have no authority. There's no such thing as nullification, they say to me.
Right.
Well, I
right.
point to all the counties and cities across the United States that have passed, declared themselves to be sanctuary cities for illegal immigration. What are they doing? They're effectively nullifying federal immigration laws. So I thought if they can do it, if they can declare themselves a sanctuary county to do something which is illegal, I thought it might be nice for a change to declare ourselves a sanctuary county to do something that was actually constitutional. So in the process of passing this resolution, we declared Carroll County to be Maryland's first Second Amendment sanctuary county. And this built a lot of excitement and gave our people a lot of hope.
So that's kind of all the pre-work that you did, because the other two counties were the ones that were 1 and 2, Hartford and the other one, Cecil, passed it first, but you guys actually did all the pre-work.
Well, I don't want to say all the pre-work. I had created a website called upholdmyoath.com, which talked about the responsibilities of locally elected officials to stand up and comply with their oath of office to defend the Constitution. And the data that was in upholdmyoath.com was used by both Cecil and Hartford County to help them develop their model. So the embryonic beginnings of this, I would argue, came out of Carroll County. But we're thrilled that they took the lead in adopting them first.
And what would have happened if you didn't pass this resolution?
Well, I've always said the Constitution will not enforce itself. And we have to be careful, because if we don't push back because we want to appear to be reasonable, the danger is that we will further embolden them. In our efforts to be reasonable, we sometimes demonstrate that we will tolerate things that really should not be tolerated. And I think the importance of this is to send a message to the legislature that we are going to stand in defense of our citizens' constitutional rights. And it's really a way of holding up a stop sign that says, don't cross this line, don't go any further, because you've already crossed it.
You had mentioned earlier about not authorizing money and resources and whatnot for this law. But my question is then, can you be held accountable for not enforcing the law in some way?
Well, we always have reasonable discretion with respect to how we enforce laws. You know, I've had officials within the state ask me the same question. When a person drives down the road going 31 miles an hour in a 30 zone, the sheriff has reasonable discretionary powers to decide whether or not he or she is going to do a traffic stop. And usually they won't if a person's going 1 or 2 miles an hour over the limit. The same thing with the state's attorney. They have the ability to apply reasonable discretion to assure that we don't needlessly criminalize otherwise law-abiding citizens. So I expect our sheriff and our state's attorney will apply their same good judgment in enforcing this that they use with respect to all other laws on the books, and mainly to ensure that we don't needlessly criminalize people that are otherwise law-abiding citizens.
Right. And also I want to mention, you have Sheriff Kenneth
Dragoni
said that he will give all lawful and reasonable consideration when applying the regulations in the new gun law, which he actually called unjust. As per the resolution, the Board of Commissioners will support the Sheriff's use of the discretion to enforce the Firearm Safety Act of 2013. He's retiring in 2014. Does that pose any special consideration for you?
Well, yes. Sheriff Dragoni has been a strong supporter of our citizens' constitutional rights, and he's established a high standard for others to follow. And the resolution will be an issue for those who are running for sheriff, and I do believe it will be a question asked by citizen groups across the county. And I believe that in order to get elected as sheriff in this county, a sheriff's candidate will have to demonstrate a high level of support and a willingness to interpose themselves and defend our citizens' Second Amendment rights if they are encroached upon by either state or federal government. And sheriffs do have that power, but they have to be willing to administer it.
And in your resolution, you mentioned the use of reserve resources. Can you tell us what is meant by this And does it have a purpose, actually?
Well, it means different things to different people. Under good circumstances, it would mean that we might need more. We have a fairly small sheriff's department. We might need to deputize additional people in order to maybe deal with an environmental crisis, a weather crisis, like a tornado, something like that. But I think it's also not too much of a stretch to say that in the event of something more severe, social unrest or whatnot, he could certainly use it to deputize persons for purposes of establishing a posse if the sheriff at his sole discretion deemed it necessary.
Oh, I see. It's a little bit of a teaching thing here. You're teaching some of us. And then I also want to mention this. All of the violations of Maryland's new law will end up on the Carroll County State Attorney Jerry Barnes' desk. Does he intend to strictly enforce it?
Well, I don't want to speak for Jerry Barnes. He's an experienced state's attorney. I believe he's a patriot and a supporter of the Constitution, and I think he tends to apply discretion in such a way that he enforces all laws in a way which is constitutional. I think he tends to apply good judgment so that he doesn't needlessly criminalize law-abiding citizens. And in those cases where he believes that blind enforcement of the law would result in an injustice, I think he will apply appropriate discretion.
So then I also want to see what are some of the provisions of the new law that the resolution does not intend to negate?
Well, there are two provisions that we actually agree with in Carroll County. One is that we intend to enforce the law most strictly against existing felons. If an existing felon is in some type of a violation of this law, then I expect they will not receive any relief. And number two, this law also addresses issues of persons with a history of dangerous mental illness. I do not expect that you'll see any relief for people that fall into that category either.
Do you think that any of the other counties will follow suit?
Well, we have three. I've had a couple of commissioners from other counties contact me over the last month or two expressing interest. I think we'll see some additional counties adopt this. And it is being done in counties across places like New York. So we're not the only state that's done this, and I believe Alabama has a county that recently adopted something similar.
If enough of the counties get together, can this law somehow be, I don't want to say awashed, but changed or amended?
Well, it raises there was an old joke years ago, what if they gave a war and nobody came? Well, what if you passed a law and no county agreed to comply with it? What would happen? Well, that's what's happened with illegal immigration. So if you want to know whether or not there's a chance that I think we could effectively nullify this, I tell people nullification is not a procedure, it's a movement. And yes, if enough counties and local governments across the U.S. will refuse to comply with unconstitutional infringements, I believe we can have the effect of negating them, and more importantly, send a message to Congress and send a message to state legislatures, don't go there.
But then the other way to counteract this is to elect officials who are in favor of the Second Amendment.
Absolutely, or better yet, officials that
so
take
we
an oath to the
have to bring the information to the voters.
Yes, and I would say this to all students, all citizens, choose carefully. You know, you may or may not agree with the ideals of a particular candidate, but one thing that we know is this: the Constitution is a fantastic document. And our forefathers believed that your rights don't come from government, they come from God. And that's a very important distinction that makes us different than any other country in the world. Because if government gave you your rights, then government can take them away. And one of the purposes of the Bill of Rights is to ensure that our citizens' unalienable rights, that's right given to us under natural law or God, of life, liberty, and property, can never be taken by government. And our citizens need to remember, whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Libertarian, whether you're indifferent, to allow these constitutional protections to be breached is very dangerous. The purpose of our Constitution is to keep government in a limited box where the role of government was to defend your unalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. And once those protections are trespassed, there's great danger that your freedom, your children's freedom, and the freedom of your grandchildren may be lost forever.
Until we fight to get it back in some way.
It's much more difficult to get it back than it is to protect it from being lost. And that's why I encourage every student across the country, regardless whether or not they are, where they are on the political spectrum, to demand that every elected official tell them publicly they will uphold the entire Constitution and all the restrictions that it places on government. I had some students tell me once in one of our high schools, I asked what the purpose of government was. They said, well, the purpose of government is to control the people. See, that's exactly wrong. The purpose of our Constitution is to allow the people to control the government. Because outside of controls, the propensity throughout the history of mankind is for governments to grow bigger and stronger and become increasingly oppressive upon their people.
And unfortunately, I think a lot of people don't realize this today, because you get a lot of people who are what you call the low information voters, or those type of people where they come home from work and they're tired, and they may turn on one certain news station maybe for about 10 minutes, and then they go to bed, and then that's it. So we also have to get a better way of getting the information to them, so they can make an informed decision when they go to the polls.
Right. Well, unfortunately, the major media outlets have been disappointing. Our forefathers assumed that the power of a free press would always serve as a guardian to ensure our citizens were fully informed. But increasingly, over the last century or so, the press has turned itself into an advocacy arm for certain political movements, and in doing so has lost its objectivity. The good news is that our citizens and our young people can go to the internet, and by doing searches they can usually get the rest of the story and therefore make a fully informed decision. But I also encourage every student to take a few minutes and read the Declaration of Independence. Read at least the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, because one of the things I like about the Declaration of Independence is it says that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And when you have this many people, as we have in America today, complaining, who are angry, who are worried, who are upset, that's a pretty good indicator that the government is acting without the consent of the people. And the Declaration of Independence goes on further, and it says that if these things are not corrected, it is the right of the people, it is the duty of the people to throw off such government and install new guards for their future security. It's my hope we won't need to go that far, but remember this, the Constitution will not enforce itself. Students, citizens need to demand of their local officials that they stand in defense of the Constitution.
And where do you see the Second Amendment in 20 years?
I will say this. I will say that the Second Amendment will be a contra-indicator of where our country's going. If the it will be an indicator. If the Second Amendment is strong, that means we will most likely have our freedoms. If poor decisions by judges result in additional infringements upon the Second Amendment, it's probably a strong indication that the United States will fall into a state of tyranny. Government cannot institute tyranny among a populace which is armed. And
so what do you suggest to the people then? How do they take it back?
it starts with reading the Declaration of Independence, which will take all of 5 minutes. I recommend if our students do nothing more, they read the first 10 amendments of the Constitution and recognize that the role of government is to protect our God-given rights. And the reason that's important is if God gave us these rights, then the government has no right to take them away. That's what they have to recognize. And they have to start asking politicians where they stand on these things. The problem with America today is too many citizens are voting for politicians based on what they promise to give them. You know, a politician can buy votes by promising to give a special interest group something. Usually involves money. But a politician can never win the minds and hearts and minds of a group unless they demonstrate a conviction to stand for the same values. And I would encourage all politicians across the country to focus more on principle and more on conviction in defense of the Constitution, and stop worrying so much about whether they're pleasing a particular constituency group by giving out money. Giving out money is the unprincipled way of getting votes. The principled way of getting votes is to stand in defense of the Constitution.
And what would you say to the education system with regards to that?
I would say two things. Number one, teach it. and teach it honestly and objectively. And number two, it was never the intention of our forefathers in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, to prohibit referencing God within our public institutions. In fact, the Maryland Constitution has a religious requirement. It says no man shall be prohibited from serving on a jury providing, or an office providing he professes his belief in the existence of God. If our rights are unalienable, which means they come from our Creator, which is what our Declaration of Independence says, then you cannot properly teach the Constitution if you deny the existence of God. So I would encourage our educators to recognize, without getting into religion, that God is not a dirty word. He needs to be brought back into the public school systems. They recognize that all men are created equal, derived with the right of life, liberty, and property is given to them by their Creator. And that's just another word for God. So you cannot teach the Constitution properly if you deny the existence of God.
Right, and I don't know if it's a law for the education to require them to teach the Constitution. I do know that where I live, we have a citizens activist group who force our public schools to teach the Constitution.
Well, I don't think there's any law that says they have to teach the Constitution. I would hope that they would teach the Constitution out of love for America. And it's not only enough to teach it, it must be taught in a way which is forthright. I've seen curriculum from across the country where they ask students to circle words in the Declaration of Independence which might indicate selfish qualities on the part of our founders. That is not a proper way to teach the Constitution. I've heard Democrats, Republicans, rabbis, pastors, community leaders say that the Declaration of Independence is one of the most beautiful documents ever written. It should be taught with love. It should be taught with patriotism.
Right, right. And also, I want to get back to the Second Amendment. Under the new law, is it required that citizens who purchase weapons take lessons or to responsibly use the weapon?
Yeah, there is a requirement under the new law that citizens receive training prior to taking delivery of their weapon. And I find this rather amusing because there are all types of guns. There are guns that are revolvers, there are single action, double action. There are semi-automatic guns that are single action, double action. There are guns that have magazine safeties, guns that have hammer safeties. And to try to teach someone safety provisions about a handgun without having the actual firearm present is an exercise in futility. It would have made much more sense to say if once you get your gun, you need to take a few hours of training with the dealership with that specific firearm so that you know how to use it properly, because it can get complicated.
Right, and to use it responsibly.
Well, hopefully it'll never have to be used, but certainly there are fundamental safety provisions that anyone who owns a firearm understands. All guns are loaded, and they should always be treated as if they're loaded.
Right, right. And I also want to ask you, I want you to pretend that you're teaching a class right now of, let's say, history major or political science at the college level. And it's in this time, with these problems, what advice will you give to the youngsters? It's kind of a hard one. Not a hard one,
I would teach them, first off, they have to be taught. I don't want to sound like a broken record. They have to be taught the importance of having a government where our rights are deemed unalienable. Because in countries that do not believe in unalienable rights, the danger is you're only one generation away from having a new set of elected officials take those rights away. Our forefathers said that we have these unalienable rights given to us by our Creator because it was their intention that no man, no government, no politician ever take them away.
But would you encourage them to run for office?
Yes. Yes, I would.
And how about starting a grassroots organization?
Again, of course, but that's like asking me if I think that investing is good. Well, you can be a good investor or a bad investor. You can be a good elected official or a bad elected official. You should only run for office if you are committed to upholding the Constitution. If you don't like the Constitution and you don't believe in what it says, then my advice is don't run for office. Because when you run for office in America, what you're really saying is, I accept this office with the intentions of upholding the Constitution. So if it's not your intention to do that, then don't run.
Wow. And I do want to bring this up. We had a newspaper, it was called The Gannett, who had researched through the open records who owned a gun in New York. I know that was one. Maybe northern New Jersey. And what this newspaper did was published all the names and addresses of those who owned a gun. And I looked at that. I definitely saw it as activism, but I saw that as also hurting those who do not own a gun, because if you're a criminal, you're going to look in the newspaper and say, oh, this person doesn't own a gun, therefore they can be robbed.
Well, that's correct. What you bring up, though, this is an example of activists behaving without considering the implications of their poor decisions. Not only does it expose non-gun owners to potential criminal activity, because it now assures criminals that they can go into houses knowing they're not going to get shot, it also increases the likelihood that guns will be stolen, because we've now told the criminals whose house to break into if they want to steal a weapon. And third, this is a great disrespect to our citizens. You know, there are citizens out there that own guns where perhaps parents have maybe a daughter who was a victim of stalking, maybe a single woman was a victim of an attempted rape, and to publish who owns these guns is a disgrace. And this is an example why government should not be collecting this type of data, because what government has proven and what the officials
have surveillancing us.
They have proven they cannot be trusted with this data. That's what government has proven, and we never want that data in a central repository. God forbid, 50 years from now, America got into a major war and an enemy came onto American shores. Would you want them to have the data so they know who every citizen was that had a gun? Of course not.
But that's what it seems to be like today. They kind of know who has a gun and who doesn't.
Yeah, and we need additional privacy laws to prevent the disclosures of that type of data. That data should not be available under Freedom of Information Act because it's too sensitive and it needs to be protected.
So are there any penalties against people like, or newspapers like the Gannett who did that?
Well, there are municipalities across the country that are taking steps right now to try to put protections in. And I actually believe that, if my memory serves, I think the Firearms Safety Act included some language that would put restrictions on the release of that kind of data. So there was a little bit of a silver lining, I think.
Right, right. So but that's just another area that we need to work on, probably even as a country, because it's going to be going on all over the country.
Well, yeah, I mean, you really bring up a broader issue, Doreen, and that's the issue of privacy. That's really what we're talking about. You know, the Fourth Amendment protects Americans from unreasonable searches and seizures. It protects their privacy. And not only do we have a risk to their privacy from them disclosing things such who owns a gun and who does not, but now we've got new technology out there today, such as drones. Now we've got drones disguised as hummingbirds. They can spy on farmers, can spy on ranchers, can spy on you through your bedroom window. And I think we're going to have to look at putting additional restrictions on the use of some of these things to protect the privacy and the Fourth Amendment rights of our citizens.
Thank you, Commissioner Rothschild. And to our viewers, for more information on the show, please go to campusteaparties.com. That's campusteaparties.com. And thank you for watching us.